All right. I think we can get started. Um, Welcome, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Wilkins. I am President and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, and it is my delight to welcome you all to our webinar today. It is on a topic that is near and dear to my heart as a mother of two children. And also, frankly, the daughter or daughter-in-law of three aging parents thinking about what care means for all of us in today's economy. Um, as many of us have experienced in deeply personal ways, as I said, the United States is facing a care crisis. Too many working families lack reliable, high-quality childcare, and many more are priced out altogether. Millions of parents are forced to pay exorbitant costs, compromise on convenience and quality, or make difficult decisions about their families, their jobs, and their careers. At the same time, childcare providers themselves make poverty wages despite the deep importance of their work, leading to a workforce shortage that makes matters worse. The US has long considered childcare a problem for the private market, even as those markets have failed our families and our children. More recently, private equity firms have begun to see this market as a ready opportunity to extract money from both families and the government. The simple fact is, childcare is a public good, and we should be responding to these market failures with bold public solutions. And we here at Roosevelt are in the solutions business, especially when things are getting worse. We need a vision for the future. We just saw Congress pass a devastating bill that will gut supports for families. We are watching some political leaders absurdly, maybe even cruelly, tout tiny child tax credits paired with huge Medicaid and SNAP cuts as, quote, child forward. What we are doing here is putting forward a bold new vision for what works for parents, for children, and for the economy. We are proposing a federal investment strategy centered on our core beliefs that we all have a common interest in taking care of our youngest children, and that we need public policies to embrace that common interest. That means policies that center public provisioning, workforce equity, and protection from extractive private market models. Today, we've got a great panel of experts to talk about the different forms such policies can take. Each of our panelists has fresh ideas for what our childcare system and economy could look like if we put American families and workers front and center and put corporations in their place. And each has released a new Roosevelt paper this summer, so I highly recommend reading those if you haven't already. But first, I am honored to introduce our keynote speaker, U.S. Senator Andy Kim. Prior to entering the Senate in December of last year, Senator Kim represented New Jersey's 3rd Congressional District. He previously served in USAID, the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House National Security Council, and in Afghanistan as an advisor to Generals Petraeus and Allen. So what I'm telling you is he is your consummate public servant. As New Jersey's junior senator, he is focused on combating corruption, ensuring our democracy is reflective of all American voices, building an economy where everyone can afford to provide a better future for the next generation, and shaping a global agenda to make America safer and more secure. As Senator Kim has said, no parent should feel that anguish of a price tag getting in the way of what your kid needs. And he's putting his money where his mouth is. He's a co-sponsor of the proposed Building Childcare for a Better Future Act. He's fought hard this year against the president's reconciliation bill, which, as I said, will devastate millions of children, parents, and families. And he is laser focused on what we need to do next, from making sure our kids don't go hungry at school to making sure opportunities for service are there when they're ready to graduate. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Senator Kim. Senator Kim, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Elizabeth, and thanks to everybody for joining up. Thanks to the Roosevelt Institute for pulling together this incredibly important discussion, but more importantly, for bringing new ideas to the table for a vital issue that honestly sits at the intersection of affordability, of workforce, of education, and honestly, generational aspirations. Childcare isn't just about managing kids for a part of the day, and our nation's approach to it has been, so far off and has been a really major missed opportunity to help millions of kids get a running start at life. What I also hate is that it really adds to this sense of burden when it comes to parenthood. That childcare is somehow something that we have to endure and just get through, and that the stresses and strains are a rite of passage. That mentality is clearly wrong, but one that is unfortunately ever so present. I think through my own experiences, me and my wife, we felt this. When our first kid was born, we simply couldn't find a childcare facility within 30, 40-minute radius of our house that had space available. The wait lists were so long that my wife and I were just thinking about how we should maybe get on the list for our potential second child down the road. And we felt that it was hopeless for our first. And look, we were just coming off of parental leave. And instead of being able to focus on our parental leave as a time of helping my wife recover from the delivery, as well as treasuring that time with the newborn, we spent so much of that time of parental leave just trying to figure out what comes next. The anxiety, the stress, we had so much of that challenge. And it was exacerbated by the fact that my employer at the time was the federal government, which at that time had no paid parental leave. And with the best we were offered was unpaid leave through FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. Now, that is something that I was able to help address once I came into Congress and passing legislation that gave parental leave to all federal employees. But I remember just the challenges at that time. And I remember when I came into Congress, I had a 1 year old and a 3 year old by the time I came into Congress. And I remember Steny Hoyer gave me a call the day after I had won to congratulate me and said I was going to really enjoy my time coming into Congress. Let him know if I have any questions. And I had one for him. The only question I asked him in that first call was, is there childcare available at Congress for new members coming in? Of which he didn't know the answer to at the time. And I unfortunately learned the hard way that there were a lot of challenges there. But it was just something that was first and foremost on my mind, first and foremost on other parents' minds, no matter what their job is. And, for mine, it included, long times away from my family during the week, unreliable schedule, long commutes, including for my wife. And that is not unique to people who have jobs in Congress. Many families go through this. And we paid more for childcare than we did for our monthly housing, more for our mortgage than our mortgages, by far more. And once I was actually confronted by someone when I was advocating for helping support families that are experiencing this cost from childcare, I had someone confront me and say that the reason why my childcare and the childcare of so many families is so high is probably because that we're trying to get fancy childcare, that childcare with all the bells and whistles. And that's the kind of mindset that we have to be able to express in terms of what is actually the situation, because it was far from it when it came to my case. And I know that so many families, we're just trying to figure out how to be able to provide that kind of support at a baseline level. The unaffordability of childcare is one of the first major points of deviation in the trajectory of families in America. It sits outside of the bounds of what our society has so far deemed necessary for all, and has not been accepted across our land as a good in and of itself that should be understood as a universal good. So I appreciate all of you gathering to discuss this, to help us think through how to be able to build that path forward, to make the case that childcare isn't a nice to have. It isn't just something where we can say that our national strategy is to have grandma and grandpa help out. There are some good ideas being circulated in Congress, many of which I'm supportive of, but there's room for so much more thinking to be done. A lot of the discussion that I've had in the Senate, in Congress so far, is about how do we help families afford childcare. Now, that is extremely critical and a huge part of the problem. But what we haven't done enough of is to actually talk through why is childcare so expensive to start with in America, to understand the structural and the systemic challenges that we are facing that are driving the costs, driving the scarcity, driving so much of what is struggling for families right now. I also want to reinforce this isn't just about parents. Now, Elizabeth mentioned the workforce challenges. For those that I am entrusting my children to during the day, people who want to be able to support families, want to work with kids, and the challenges that they are facing in terms of salary and compensation, in terms of workforce stability and reliability. There are all sorts of challenges there that we need to unpack. but also just fundamentally, it's about the kids. Again, it isn't just about clearing up some time for me to be able to go to work. I don't have to reiterate to all of you the research that's been done about how critical the early years of development are for kids. Our society shouldn't just have an interest to help us with the birth and maybe maternity, paternity leave, and then leave a gap until kindergarten and pre-K. We can't just outsource our childcare to iPads and screens and think that that won't have a negative effect on a generation of kids. I've seen bipartisan calls and I've had bipartisan conversations with my colleagues in the Senate for greater attention to mental health challenges faced by kids, about the need to develop up domestic talent to take on the workforce needed at a rapidly growing moment of competitiveness around the world. If that's the case, then let's not think of the early years of a child as expendable from a developmental standpoint. Finally, I understand that in many ways we have a right that we are right now scrambling just to hold on to what we have, worried about the backsliding from this terrible reconciliation bill and other actions that are gutting Head Start, K through 12 education, IDEA, and other critical pillars of support for so many families. Yes, we need to take that on, and I will do everything I humanly can in the US Senate to be able to support that. And I know that's going to be part of this conversation. But we also need to make sure is that we have space to talk about what we are for, not just what we are against, what we are trying to move our country towards, not what we're trying to avoid, and be able to give that vision for parents and families right now about what our aspirations are for our nation and for their kids and families. My kids are now 8 years old and 9 years old. The younger one just turned 8 the other day. I think it's important to be able to step up and have that conversation about what kind of America our kids are growing up in. I'll be honest with you, as a job that takes me away from my kids a lot, I've questioned whether or not, I'm able to do this work in the way that I need to and be able to support my family, but also be a constituent, to be a voice for my constituents. Sometimes I've wondered, is this the right time for me to be a member of Congress, work in elected as an elected official? But I'll be honest with you, what I've come to see, especially being a parent of kids in childcare during the pandemic, is that it's important to have the voices of parents of young kids in the Senate, in Congress, in government, but also just throughout our democracy. I just did a town hall this past weekend. And look, at a town hall during the middle of summer, early on the morning on a Saturday, my team was thinking maybe we'd have 50, 100, maybe 150 people. We had over 500 people show up. It was great to see so much energy for people paying attention to their democracy right now. But I'll be honest with you, there were not that many parents of young kids that showed up, not because they aren't interested, but because they are overwhelmed. The issue of childcare often doesn't get enough attention because those in need of it most are the ones just trying to keep their head above water. They're trying to be able to manage their commute and their jobs. Or they are kids that are too young to speak. And that just gives us all the more importance for us to be able to step up, to be able to get inputs from parents and others about the work we're trying to build for our country, to put it on a better path. And as a parent of young kids in the Senate, I hope you see in me as someone who is trying to be a partner in this effort, who is just frankly, I'm tired and exhausted of the same old, same old. It clearly isn't working. It's time for a change. And I'm grateful to the Roosevelt Institute and to others to help envision that change and to be able to work with me and others to try to implement that and be able to deliver for so many families right now in this time of need. So thanks so much for letting me be able to say a few words. I'll look forward to the conversations to come, as well as the actual efforts to be able to implement it. So let's get to work. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Senator Kim, for your words and your exhortations. I have to say, one of the things that is particularly refreshing about your commentary is the way in which you have put parents and children and workers at the center, understanding what our needs and anxieties and aspirations are, and working out from there to figure out where we should go and connecting those fears and worries and anxieties to the structural concerns that we actually need to attack with our policy proposals. I think that is what the project is right now, right? Is to start with the human beings who are trying to have a reasonable, good, stable life, and then figuring out what are the structural policies that we can enact to radically change what it means to be able to live a good life, feed your family, have a little bit of leisure time with your family, care for your loved ones. So thank you very much for that.
Mm.
Now, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, I'll introduce Jessica Calarco, who will be moderating our panel for today. As a Roosevelt Institute Fellow, Jessica does research that addresses structural inequalities and repairs trust in public institutions by centering the politics of care. She is a sociologist and a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the author of Holding It Together: How Women Became America's Safety Net. Jessica, take it away.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Or thank you so much, Elizabeth, for introducing me. Thank you to Senator Kim for sharing his insights. I'm really looking forward to this panel today. It's a pleasure to be here with you and an honor to have a chance to talk about such a pressing problem. As Elizabeth mentioned, during this next part of today's session, we'll hear from three experts on childcare, each of whom recently co-authored or authored a paper with the Roosevelt Institute, and whose work can help us to imagine the kind of better path forward that Senator Kim was stressing that we so desperately need. I'll briefly introduce our three experts, and then we'll open it up. I'll ask them each to share a bit about the papers and their visions for a future of childcare, and then we'll get into a deeper Q&A. So first, we have Catherine Ann Edwards, who's a PhD economist, a policy consultant, and host of the Optimist Economy podcast and author of the Kedits Substack. We have Elliot Haspel, who's a senior fellow at the think tank Capita, and the author of the books Crawling Behind and the forthcoming Raising a Nation. And we have Jennifer Wells, the director of economic justice at Community Change, where she leads initiatives on power and equity in the care economy. So thank you to the three of you for being with us today and for being part of this discussion. To kick things off, I'll ask you briefly to tell me about these new papers that you have. Specifically, what led you to write this paper? What was the sort of driving impetus behind it? And how does your paper envision the future of childcare? So Catherine, can you kick us off?
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me here. I'm excited to talk about it. My proposal started with the question of, what is the scope of the problem when it comes to childcare? And if you step back from kind of the situation we're in and think about it, it really is so much bigger than childcare. And in some ways, it's that the K through 12 school system and the labor market will never cohere, right? School won't start at age 0. It won't go past 3 p.m. It won't, last in the summer. And jobs aren't, take breaks for 5 years or break for the summer at stop at 3 p.m. And so this idea that parents need to find a safe and enriching place to put their kid, it doesn't stop at age 5. And anyone who's ever signed up for summer camp for their children will tell you it doesn't get any lower stakes in terms of how stressful it is to find care. And so I try to envision, if you consider the problem to be this unstoppable force of the labor market and this immovable object of schools, how would we fill it in if we filled it in with intention? And so what I proposed is the child development system, a universal, unified early childhood after school and summer program where all kids have access to high quality enriching care while their parents are at a typical workday. The premise of the system is that it empowers communities to build out ecosystems of care and coverage within their locality.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Elliot, can you share a bit about yours?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me. So, I really started from this premise of thinking about how do we build, really thinking about how we build family policy more broadly. It's going to promote the stability and quality of family life. But one particular piece of the childcare conversation that I felt was lacking was what happens with these businesses and these childcare businesses when it comes time for them to sell, when the owner wants to sell for whatever reason. And I'd been thinking about this for a couple of years, actually, because I've been doing research and analysis on the influence of investors and private equity in childcare. And back when I was doing that, I came across this letter that a private equity-backed company was sending around unsolicited to childcare programs in the Midwest. And it started with this line: have you ever considered how you might transition your business to a new owner? And it occurred to me that, we're talking a lot about how do we get more money into the system. There's also this question of what's happening with the existing supply. And because we've miscast childcare as a market good, is this place where basically when an owner wants to sell, they have very, very few options. So if you happen to have an attractive, sort of business in a place where there's an affluent clientele, then yeah, private equity firm or venture capital backed firm might want to buy your business. If you happen to have a business that's in a rural area or a lower income area, there may be no one that wants to buy your business, which means either it's just going to close and sit abandoned, or you're going to end up selling it to someone who wants to convert it to a non-childcare use. So my paper really envisions different methods and different strategies and models for helping public sector interventions that would support ownership transition and keep that supply sort of high, and also keep that supply working well for kids and families.
Excellent. Thank you. And Jennifer.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And at Community Change, our mission is to abolish poverty. And so our approach to this work comes at the intersection of both Catherine and Elliot, and adds another group of stakeholders. So we are working and organizing with parents, we're organizing with providers and small business owners, and we also are organizing the workers of childcare centers. And in this organizing, as we've pushed at the state and local level, we've always understood at the federal level, we need a major influx in investment, which we were able to see the results of for a moment during the pandemic and right immediately after the pandemic with the American Rescue Plan. And so we were able to see in just a short amount of time what a federal investment could do before it was literally snatched out of our hands. And so with that approach, we know that this childcare system is fragmented and broken. We know that it is not a private market that is going to build the solution, that we need bold and transformative change, and that has to come from a universal public system. And what would that look like? And so from that approach, understanding that the folks that are typically left out of that conversations are the folks that are often feeling the impact the most, which are the stakeholders and the constituencies that we organize. So with that was bringing them to the table to ask them what the solutions are, because we do believe that the people impacted the most are the ones with the solutions at hand. And with those conversations, we were able to frame out through values, which I think is important, particularly for the conversation around childcare and children. Values are what lead the framework for this paper, but also the framework for the system that people want to see. And what does it look like for it to be affordable, universal, streamlined, and coordinated? Most importantly, and I know I'm skipping over a couple of parts of that framework, but what does it look like to include a just transition? Because we know the system was built on the back, and this also infuses the racial justice aspect. This system was built on the backs of Black, Indigenous, immigrant women, and making certain that they are not left out as the solution is brought to the forefront. So thank you.
Excellent. Yes, thank you so much, Jennifer. And so to kick us off in terms of questions, for broader discussion, one of the points that I saw echoed in all of your pieces and heard you all stress today was the need for public investments here, and specifically the need for a public, imagining a public system of childcare. And so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and maybe we'll start with Jennifer and then pass it around to the other panel members. But why is public investment, or why is a public system such an important part of the puzzle here in terms of solving this childcare crisis?
So it's already been mentioned earlier, and I think I just mentioned in my opening statement about this is put on the backs of people. It's put on the backs of a private market. And I think one of the providers that's quoted in the paper put it beautifully. She said, "We're doing a public good, but we're not being compensated publicly." And that says it all, along with the fact that, and I mentioned it earlier, we saw what a public investment can do. When our partners at the state level are fighting for transformative systems, they are fighting for an influx of funding that will help streamline what already is, we know is a broken system. There is some tension in that, it's addressed in our paper, around who's at the table when we are building a solution, and again, who could get left out of this solution. But we, at the end of the day, all come to it has to be invested at the federal level. There has to be an influx of money that is able to pay the workers and support workers, that are able to support small business owners and providers that are so necessary, but also are not putting the burden on parents. They cannot take anymore. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, Elliot or Catherine?
I'm happy to hop in, and I think that's spot on, Jennifer. I also think this also goes to this bigger question of what is childcare? Who is childcare for? What is its place in a society, right? Because if childcare is merely there to attach a parent to the labor force, right? And then that's in a different position. That childcare is actually an essential part of our social infrastructure. And I sometimes think about it as, right, like we have this bucket of things that we say as a society are so important that we're going to roll up tax dollars, pay for it through the public purse, and in most cases make it free or nearly free at the point of service, right? And that's, you can think about that as public schools, roads, libraries, fire departments, or public parks. Even people who could easily pay for them can attack, Bill Gates can go to the public library and check out a book for free. And so then there's another set of things that we say, like, that's not the case. And you're basically responsible for it yourself, right? And so that's things like, acquiring a vehicle for yourself, obviously, pet insurance, vet care, things like that. That goes in this sort of private bucket. And you know this well from your work, Jessica, but for a long time in this country, especially since the 70s, we've really shifted to this idea of childcare is over here in this like private individual bucket, and really it falls on the shoulders of women more than anyone. And so I think what if we're saying though, a lot of us in these papers are making the argument actually, if you look at the totality of what childcare does for child development, for family functioning, for the ability of families to stay rooted in communities, for public health and safety, for social connectivity. The ripple effects are so significant. When Senator Kim was talking about, it's not just the parents who benefit from this. Then it should be in the public realm. It's in the public realm. It needs to have public investment. So that's really, I think, all three of our papers nod in various ways towards this shift from the private bucket to the public bucket. And I think that's in a lot of cases what's underlying the problems we have in childcare in this country.
I'll just add that, for anyone out there who is, a free market proponent who thinks that markets do things better, I would just point out the market has had 80 years. We've basically had a childcare market since the end of World War II and the pullback of the Lanham Act funds, and you had 80 years of runway, and frankly, the results are not inspiring. So I appreciate that, like, this is America and the free market has to come first. And if something can be profitable, it should be profitable. But with 80 years of evidence in hand, we can we can pretty assuredly come to the conclusion that this isn't working. So I respect your free market points of view. Unfortunately, it has failed in this case. And so it's time to move on with something better for families. And I try to always frame it from that perspective of like, lest we forget, we have been living in the more conservative free market experiment for 4 generations. So now it's time to move on to something better.
I think that's a great segue to my next question here, which is about persuading the public. We are in a moment right now, politically and socially, where there's a lot of skepticism around government programs, around public programs in particular, around government spending. And we're also in a moment where we're seeing retrenchment around traditional, quote unquote, traditional gender ideologies, where we're seeing rampant racism. How do we push back against those kinds of potential skepticisms of the kind of public model, the kind of more equitable model that we're calling for here?
Something that I point out is that scarcity can make you pretty uncreative. And that we have been all conditioned by 80 years of this free market system to really expect the least. We now take on face value that not every family should be served with high quality childcare. They simply don't deserve it because they're not rich enough. We take on face value that the the people who deserve the most are the people who can pay the most. And we've never really set our sights on the alternative, I think in some ways because we're so scared to lose what we have. And so I think it's important to recognize how many parents, maybe aren't as at odds as they seem because they're terrified of what could change when they're holding on to what little they have, white knuckled. For me, I think the role of women in society has always been a really convenient straw man. Like, what's really distracting to bring up what women should do, because then you won't look squarely Congress in the eye to say you are underinvesting in children. And so I think that it's helpful for all of us to recognize that people feel very strongly about that straw man, but it is what it is. You could be an absolutely devout women should never leave the home, or you could be I think, all women should have the right to have children and not have a partner and work high career jobs. That doesn't matter. If you look at it from an economic or societal standpoint, we have a gap to fill. You don't have to use that gap, but the economy needs that gap filled. And that is, that's not really arguable from any sense of children are doing better, families are doing better, women are doing better. And so I think I just keep the straw man argument like at the bar over drinks where it belongs. And when you're ready to talk policy and what the economy and families need, like we will come back to how to expand childcare. It's not fair to put onto a system the expectation that all families have to use it.
And I also think that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, you go ahead. Go after.
Okay. So I think some of this too, build on Catherine's point is how we are basically trying to sell and talk about childcare and what it is and to what our vision for it is. And I think, again, if we kind of go back to the values standpoint, I think sometimes we have a tendency, and I also call myself out in this too, and that's Shankar Osorio, who's a great communications expert, talks about sometimes you sell the brownie, you don't sell the recipe. And I think sometimes we get a little bit too busy selling the recipe on childcare. It occurs to me in my conversation, when you start with every family should have guaranteed access to the kind of care they need to live the life they want to live and be the parents they want to be, it gets past a lot of the noise. There was recently polling done, I think it was Pure Gallup, and they pulled on American values, and far and away, the top value held by Americans across all ideological spectrums is family. Right? Like beat everything up, freedom, it's family. And so when you start there, then I think you can get when we start, it's the conversations when we get caught in who is it okay for the care to be provided for? Is it about we're only caring about licensed programs, or we only want grandparents, we only want stay-at-home parents, as opposed to look, like families have diverse needs. We're a huge country. There's a huge diversity in what families want and need, and we should meet them there. And meeting them there is going to mean we're going to have to support different systems in different ways. And so I think when we start at that point, then we can build up the case for public support, because it turns out, and we have examples of this, that like when it comes to brass tacks, actually people are okay with it. And what I mean by that is you can look at places like the small rural towns in Nebraska, in Minnesota, in Western Colorado that are turning to government solutions when they can't keep families. In Nebraska, they didn't have teachers to run their schools. So they started a government, funded childcare program. In Minnesota, they couldn't keep enough families there. And so in Western Colorado, the city of Montrose, they couldn't keep enough police officers on the force. And so I think, again, if we get caught in this sort of like culture war, and it's a tripwire, I think it's worth saying that is often set by those on the political right. But I think we also run ourselves right over it pretty frequently, instead of pulling back and saying that's not even the right conversation. The conversation is, how do we make sure every family has what they need to thrive and to flourish? And that gets you a lot further.
Echoing Elliot's point, because it's brilliant, is just meet it head on. You have to have conversation. We found that when we had the conversations around the paper with providers and the parents and the childcare workers, and what we found was when they talked about Head Start, right? There was a great example. There was a lot of suspicions around how the government could hold the system and hold a universal childcare system. But then they also named how important Head Start was and all the great examples. So they also had a positive take on what government could do. And once we were in that part of the conversation, then the vision and the propensity for the vision of a universal childcare system was like more concrete, and we could really dig into that conversation. And it didn't negate the fact that there is the idea of Big Brother being involved, but when you address it head on, right, people are ready for that conversation. People are open to that conversation. They want to have it, and then they want to dig into what solutions are because they understand what isn't working. We just open the pathway for what can work, and we all know that we have to have this. The federal government has to be involved.
Absolutely. And I love this idea of starting from a program that people do deeply care about and recognize the value of, and using that as the entry point to these kinds of conversations. Absolutely. So the next question that I want to turn to here is about workforce, in the sense that, right now we are already facing a huge shortage of childcare spots for families who need them, for people who need them. But at the same time, and so to provide this kind of universal public coverage to ensure that every child and every family gets the care that they need, we're going to need not only public investments, but also a rapid and massive expansion of the childcare workforce. So I'm curious to hear what do you all think about what that might look like, what it might take to expand and ensure that that workforce is not only there, but ideally sustainably supported. What would it look like to provide a childcare workforce that can last for the long term and not just maybe meet gaps in the short term? So maybe Elliot, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Sure. I mean, I think the short answer is we need public money that is going to direct wage supplements, right? The market, to Catherine's point, cannot, will not, will never create the family sustaining wages and the compensation that early childhood educators deserve. And so, and we have promising models, right? Like DC's Pay Equity Fund is fantastic. It's now proven out, right? There's evaluations of it. It's not, this is rocket science. When you pay people better and you offer them health insurance and, then they are able to do the job that they want to do. I think what I find to be a little bit sort of dangerous is sometimes I think there's too much of a tendency to go through the affordability door and just talk that only about that and leave the workforce as sort of, oh, we'll deal with that later because it's not, but the problem there, to your point, is then you end up doing things like juicing demand without having enough supply there to meet it. You end up things like, questionable quality. And so I do think we need to really have a strong conversation about none of this works. Absolutely none of it works unless you have the workforce in place. And that means direct compensation. The other thing I'll say too is, again, that's not, in my view, which is not a universal view, but in my view, that's not just licensed educators. That is family, friend, and neighbor caregivers should be compensated. I think stay-at-home parents should be compensated. This is done regularly in other peer nations. If we're going to say that a child care system means that all child care providers are able to provide that care without being stressed, being present with the kids under their care, that means it's incumbent on us to see all of the child care system as needing compensation. And again, it's not going to mean it looks exactly the same, but they should all be included.
Absolutely. I'll also name when it comes to workers is them having the rights for collective bargaining and being able to name not only what the solutions are for them to thrive in this position, but also a pathway and a ladder for them to improve, whether they want to come in as an educator and then become a provider and a small business owner themselves. But there has to be basic rights that they're able to name and to fight for. And I think that it's been the case in some select spaces that folks have organized and been able to win collective bargaining rights, but that's got to be across the uniform, right? And I agree, we can't just stick with the demand side. Supply side has to be addressed. All of the administrative burdens that fall upon providers, particularly small providers, family, friend, and neighbor providers, even the ways in which they have to navigate a system that is just not built for them. It's actually built to erase them and to remove them. And so that has to be changed, along with the fact that we just have to have folks available that can take care of kids. And so that the parents know that there's not, as Senator Kim said, 30-minute, 40-minute drive to even find available childcare. But if we are paying workers thriving wages, supporting the folks that are owning the centers, providing the centers, and making them available, we will be able to, with the investment, of course, with the large federal public investment, we'll be able to make certain that folks are able to get the care that they deserve and that their children need. Yeah. Pass to you, Catherine.
Yeah, in my proposal, I talked a lot about how profitability really squanders policymaking and creativity. If I've got to make money off of a 3-year-old, there's just not much that I get to do. And so I talked about this in reference to the workforce of things like we could have registered apprenticeships for childcare workers, right? Something that involves, you know, upskilling people who not. I think the worry that I wanted to talk about was that if the federal money comes in for childcare, all of a sudden the people who have been doing this work get usurped by college educated people and they get forced out of the childcare market. And so the way that I wanted to think about it is how do you do justice for the current workforce for both the fact that yes, they're underpaid, but they're also underinvested in. And if they do invest in themselves, there's almost no return for it. And so I thought about it as kind of an investment return model and how much you could, again, just have a truly creative policy of like, let's have registered apprenticeships, let's have associate's degree programs that you can complete at night that give you tracks on behavior or nutrition or health or, early numeracy and literacy. And you set up a special program so that people who want to become their own providers and start their own business get resources to do so. And when you take having to make money off of this scenario off the equation, off the table, you can really think about, from the blank slate, how do I build the best childcare workforce possible? And then it just opens up so many more things. I think also in a system in which costs are less of a concern, you can do more to integrate who else gets to be part of this system. And so I talk about things like you could have someone who works in childcare, but who is like the regional kind of social worker, right? It's hard to have a social worker and a nurse and a doctor and someone specialized at every center, but you could have a team of people that maybe have much more education, but they're not supplanting workers, they're supplementing them with backup care as necessary. Again, I mean, I could talk about this for hours because I'm a labor economist and I think so much about workforce, but again, like these are all conversations we can't have if we have to make money.
And I think
I
that's,
wanted
if I
to
could just say
add
real quickly,
something.
okay, good, Jennifer.
Okay, quickly add the idea that our paper also addresses how we are thinking about pushing back on the corporate capture and the private equity threat to the market. So that is also something I wanted to name. That's hugely important. I consider them the big bad wolf that's like sitting at the door, ready to pounce and ready to extract. And so making certain that we have that as at the center of our conversations is also important. Elliot, I know that's a threat around the small business owners in particular. I'm in Alabama, and there's a lot of small business childcare centers where they're aging out. They're in their senior years. They want to move on, and that might be the only option for retirement for them. And so that conversation needs to be had. We need to be in conversation now and pushing forward.
Yeah, that was actually exactly what I was going to talk about, the sort of investor kind of threat there. And I think that's absolutely right. We need to have, as we're bringing in more public money into the system, strong guardrails against profiteering behavior. And the other thing too is, we think about the politics of this, right? Like what we're all describing is a vision where you're putting lots of public money in, being invested in these programs and being invested in making care free. I think that should be said too, by the way, and something I really appreciate across of our papers is and this idea of, if it is truly a public good, then should parents be paying anything at the point of service? And that's, a fairly radical thing to suggest, but I think it's becoming more and more mainstream, and I would like it to continue becoming more mainstream because it puts the onus on on an opponent to say, why should this be pay to play? Why should we have haves and have-nots, depending on that? Like, why is childcare that kind of a good? So I think it's also important to within that think about the role of these investor-backed, childcare chains, and how do we put up guardrails to make sure that any public money is being used for the public good.
On that point about potential threats to the system, to the existing system, and to the future of that system going forward around things like private equity, there's a number of great questions in the Q&A and in the chat, and so I wanted to turn to some of those. And particularly, there's a question about the moment that we find ourselves in right now with things like the quote unquote big beautiful bill, and about how, like, what are we risking right now with the kinds of changes that are happening, that are being proposed or being enacted with policy. What's at stake for the childcare workforce, for the childcare, for the families who need childcare, for the children who need childcare, with these kinds of policies that are coming down the pike. Maybe Jennifer, do you want to kick us off on this one?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
Sure. I
was reading the chat.
No, you're good. There's a lot of things in both the Q&A and the chat to keep track of. So basically, what are we risking with things like the big beautiful bill, with particularly around childcare, and particularly its implications for families or for the workforce, in terms of what's at stake right now?
What's at stake is they're trying to bring us back. I don't even know where to, but it's nothing. It's nowhere where we can exist. So everything is at risk. We're talking about not only workers losing their jobs, people not being able to participate in the workforce. And that's clearly something that the opposition party values so much, but yet they're completely trying to detriment, right? So we lose so many billions of dollars a year when parents cannot get back into the workforce because they can't find adequate childcare, or they have no childcare available to them. I also want to name that language is important. So this may feel a little bit non sequitur, but we refer to it often as deserts and childcare deserts, maternal health deserts, and deserts are naturally occurring when these are all policy choices, right? The reason why you can't afford childcare, the reason why there's no childcare available to you is because there's a policy choice choice. There's a lack of wages. There's a lack of thriving ability for folks to own a business. That's the reason why. Folks are not in the workforce at times where people cannot find the childcare they need. And there's one specific story. So I lived and worked and organized in West Virginia. This story comes very personal because it was somebody that I know that worked with a young woman. Childcare and the policies right now do not address the way that they are making, and I'm going to say this, making people work, right? You're not able to select occupations and careers and the times that you want that would be best for you or your family. But in this case, we know that there's shift work. Folks are working from 6 o'clock in the morning to 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and then there's second shift, and then there's the folks that work overnight. Parents are working those shifts. Who is able to watch their children at a very odd hour from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 11? Centers are not open, right? Family, friend, and neighbor may be, but they're not really paid well enough to stay open. And there's just no other options for the care that's in alternative times. And the reason I want to tell this story is a young woman who was a temp to hire, which is the way that the labor force is working now, and was able to work into a permanent job. The only shift available to her was 3 to 11. She had 2 young children. This was an opportunity for her to get the healthcare she needed for her and her family, to get a salary that would put her into, let's face it, almost a middle class range. But the thing that kept her from being able to accept the job and keep the job was childcare. And there was none available to her. All the things in this bill is just going to reinforce what that young woman experienced, what her family is going to experience. So it is the closing of more centers. It's the loss of more childcare workers to the field, them exiting to get jobs that pay more that are actually in retail. And it's going to be more and more families that are not able to provide for themselves. So poverty, starvation, all the things are at risk right now with the policies that are coming down, both at the federal and some at the state level, as long as we're not able to fix this system. And we absolutely have the tools we need to fix it.
Yeah, that's powerful, Jennifer. And I think this to me is why I find it really hard to find any praise for some of the very, very modest sort of tax improvement. There have been a few pieces that have been out lately. I actually think that, Suzanne and Lena from Roosevelt had one in MSNBC just today. It says, I've seen it called mom washing by Molly Dickens. I've seen it called care washing. Like in a way, it feels like this like gloss of because we did a minor improvement on the child independent care tax credit that doesn't even make it refundable suddenly makes it okay to to strip Medicaid away, to strip SNAP away, but also even just within childcare, I want to say 2 things. One, the downward pressure on state budgets, right? So most childcare funding, because it comes from aside from the federal block grant, right? States increasingly tried to get involved. Their state budgets are going to look really, really bad in the coming years because they're dealing with increased state share of these safety net programs. They're dealing with the economic consequences of tariffs and other things. And we're already seeing retrenchment. So Oregon, the democratically led Oregon legislature recently stripped $45 million out of their state pre-K system because of the economic outlook. So to think that just because CCDBG has not been touched and Head Start hasn't been touched at this point means that childcare is going to be unaffected by these policies, I think is foolhardy. And I think we sometimes are giving cover to just how bad it is. And then, yes, the workforce, I think, Jennifer, you laid that out well. And the last thing I'll say is, families and children don't develop in vacuums, right? So if a family is experiencing acute stress because they're struggling with food insecurity or struggling with health insurance, their health insurance premium just went up for double digits, which already we're seeing health insurers asking to be able to do with the Obamacare exchanges. Like that's going to have a direct and causal impact on child well-being. And so I think from any standpoint, we just have to be really clear-eyed that a few tax credits and sort of flat funding is actually like this tiny little piece of the scale against all of the other negative impacts that are happening for kids and families as a result of these policies.
I will add briefly that this bill is our present, but it is not the future. It can't be. It's completely financially unsustainable. Within 10 years, it's going to put interest payments on the national debt to be over a third of federal spending. We simply cannot afford to cut revenue by $4.5 trillion at this moment when we're already running $2 trillion annual deficits. So I don't know. I think in some ways I think of this bill as like a little toddler, you know, like stamping their feet and like putting their hands over their ears and saying like, no, 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 no. And then like running and having some ice cream in the corner when you told them not to, like they're going to throw up and like you'll have to clean it up, but that's okay because we know what's going to happen. And maybe they needed to throw up and get it out of their system to learn you don't get to just subsist off ice cream. In some ways, that is what Congress has been doing for 25 years. They've been addicted to ice cream and nothing else, and someone's going to have to come in with fruits and vegetables, and we all know childcare workers can do that. So I mean, I don't take a ton of heart in this bill, except for it is such an absolute unsustainable step backward. So the future is coming and it has to be different. That gives us more opportunities than I think people can really, that than people realize. So like, yeah, there's some small things in the bill. They're basically nothing because the bill is a $4.5 trillion tax cut that we will have to reverse sometime within the next 3 to 6 years. So if that is what is going to happen, we are going to reverse a tax cut in the next 3 to 6 years. We absolutely have to do it, or else we are going to default on our national debt. Then, like, get ready to sell because if we're going to raise money, we might as well pay for kids in the process.
Yeah, thank you all for your thoughts on this. I think it's timely and helpful to those in the chat trying to make their way through this. And along those lines, maybe we'll, as maybe a last wrap up question here before we close, kind of tying together a couple of threads from the Q&A and from the chat. What do we do in the short term? You know, we have this great vision for what the future of childcare could look like, and yet, you know, we're up against these kinds of threats that you all just articulated so beautifully. So what can we do? Is there a role for example, co-ops to play here? Is there a role for local governments to play here? Is there a role for providers and families to play in helping us navigate through the short term to get to this better future that we're envisioning long term? Elliot, do you want to kick us off at this one?
Sure. And thank you, by the way, Jess, for your great facilitation here. I think there are a couple of sort of levels to this. One thing I think is really important is how we start to reach parents with this. So, you know, I recently did a piece for The Guardian on this. Like, it's interesting. Parents are not in the streets as much as you might think. And you know, you've written about this, and Jess, right? Like, they're overwhelmed, they're exhausted, they've been told, they've been getting messages that it's not okay to like ask for help because it's a personal failing if they're struggling. I get all that, but I also think we're at a moment where we can start to help parents understand. We're starting, I think, in some places and with some state wins to see the kind of flywheel move here. Actually, like it shouldn't be this hard. So I know Kim was talking about this, right? Like it should not be so overwhelming, and that this is a policy choice. This is not a personal failing. This is a choice. And when there are ways, and so I do think the more we can get that message out to parents, I think there are some great organizing groups that have been, you know, going. Community Change is doing great work, right? I'm on the board of a group called Chamber of Mothers. There are lots of them. But this idea of how do you reach the everyday parents and help them understand these complicated situations? Because sometimes all they hear is like medicated work requirements. Yeah, someone should work if they're getting married. Sure, like in a sentence, that sounds okay. You have to unpack everything else that's going on. So I think that's thing one. Thing two, I think partially because this is a lot of direct childcare stakeholders on this call. I think we need to have some really serious kind of behind the scenes conversations to come to some agreements on these basic questions. Like, what are we doing about the family, friends, and neighbor caregivers? What are we doing about stay-at-home parents? Like, what is the like level of degree requirement, if any, we're wanting? Like, we need to have an answer. And I think an interesting analog, and then I'll be quiet so that Jennifer and Catherine can talk. If you look at the healthcare sector, and so what after some defeats in the 90s with the Clinton plan, they took some years in the wilderness, but they didn't just do nothing. They took those years in the early 2000s and they spent really deliberate time fighting with each other, arguing, and coming to some agreements on a couple of different well built out plans. Something I really appreciate about Catherine sort of pushing us in that direction. So that by the time the next bite at the apple did come out, it really was an opportunity. There was a fully baked plan. It was good policy. It was ready to go. And I think there's work to be done in that vein as well as we move forward.
Echoing Elliot, the foundation of the paper that we have around the public option starts with those conversations. It's the first conversation, and so that is just it. There has to be way more conversations where we are pushing back on the scarcity mindset that this administration, that the political moment is calling for, that we actually build deeper solidarity. Because one, you get parents, providers, and other folks in the room, and the workers and the educators in the room, they aren't that far apart, right? There's tensions about how do we move forward, particularly when it comes to address transition into a public option, but they're not that far apart. And so the idea of educating folks. This bill I have to give some credit where it's due. They understand how to delay the tactics, right? And so it seems like a lot of us are screaming into the void about something that some people may not be experiencing right now. And so the idea of public education and popular education, which is something that we do often, but bringing those to the folks that we have typically maybe not had a conversation with is going to be important. That is, to me, is the most important thing. Bringing them into the movement, bringing them into the conversation, starting at the local level as folks are feeling it right in their neighborhood, right in their town. There are solutions that can be had there as you escalate and build up towards the universal one. It's not going to happen overnight, but we still, if we don't start now, it'll never happen, to so to speak, because our opposition has a definite head start on us, and they have a lot of pull with the billionaires who can eat up a lot of time. But it's not that the appetite isn't there. It's how are we touching our people and talking to our people to bring them into this conversation so that it's not just the experts in the room. Everyone is an expert. If you have a child and you're looking for childcare, if you work in childcare, if you own a childcare center, you are the expert. And so how are we bringing you into the movement and making certain your power starts to escalate up?
So I was also typing questions or typing answers to some of the questions that people put in. If Jennifer and Elliot want to do like always the frenetic mindset. I'm like, oh my God, a question's unanswered. There's homework left before class is over. But you know, I think it goes back to something that Elliot said. Like, we want families to get what they need. And there are lots of complicated questions, but I think we should lead with the result we want, rather than the pathway to get there, right? Like, right now is bad. It has some bright spots. It has some incredible people. It has some amazing successes, but it's not working. So if we can agree on where we want to go, and make that the focus of the discussion, like, we get to fill in the pathway to get there. And something that I say over and over again, every time the conversation starts to go south or things start to get fractious or we start to, slip into like, but what should mothers actually be doing? I just go back to, the current system is a market failure and it will never improve. It is only going to go in one direction, and that is deterioration. So you let me know how bad you need it to get before you do something to help families, because that's basically what you're arguing, is that we need to let this market system to continue to fail as it has slowly failed for 80 years. It's only going to get more expensive, more scarce, and less reliable. So whenever there's that breaking point that's bad enough for you to do something, that's when we can do something. And I think when you make it about both like stress failure, stress goals, you can get the conversation going faster than, what do you think mom should do at 6 months? Like, what do you think? Like, you personally, you should probably decide what every mother in America does when her kid is 6 months old. So, like, why don't you go on ahead and tell us? Like, don't, it's not about that. Like, it's just, we have a system failure. We have a market failure making a system failure. So, what is the system we want? Parents can choose to do it. I try to keep the focus on the big things that we can all agree on, because there's so much consensus there.
I think that's a great place to wrap up our conversation for today. I'm sorry that we didn't have a chance to get to all of the questions in the chat, but hopefully this is just a good reason to stay engaged with all of the folks who are on this call, and to continue seeking out the great work that they are doing on this issue, and to continue participating in future conversations like this one going forward. So thank you so much to the Roosevelt Institute for hosting today's conversation. Thank you to Senator Kim for sharing your personal struggles with childcare and for your efforts to fight for a better future for childcare. And thank you so much to our panelists for helping us to imagine what that better future can be. It was a pleasure to be here with you all today.